let me go ahead and point out one thing, and it's kind of a big problem here because, again, you have this 7th century source, the Quran, and it's saying all kinds of things about Jesus. And so we could be talking about anything. If you have let's say, a source from the 1700s about George Washington, you could take that seriously because it's a 17th century source about a guy who was around in the 1700s. If someone came along from 5 centuries from now and claimed to receive revelations about George Washington, we probably wouldn't take that seriously unless they showed that those revelations are actually from God. The idea is an extremely late source. You either have to be doing tons of research to get at reliable information, or you'd need some sort of revelation. In the absence of careful research on earlier sources or some sort of divine revelation, you just wouldn't take something written 7 centuries after the events seriously. That's one issue. But the other issue is if you've got the Quran claiming that Jesus was a Muslim, and you look at the Quran and you see that the worst possible sin in Islam is the sin of shirk, associating a partner with Allah, claiming that someone is the son of God, something like that, that would be an example of associating a partner with Allah. Claiming that someone is the son of God or claiming to be the son of God, that would be the worst possible sin in Islam. Now, the issue is when we go to the Bible, we have the Father identifying Jesus as the Son. At Jesus' baptism, that you have a voice from out of heaven says, "This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased." The Spirit descends and lands on Jesus in the form of a dove. The Father and the Holy Spirit together identify Jesus as the beloved Son of the Father. Jesus identifies himself as the Son of God. He's asked point blank at his trial, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" He says, "I am." And so Jesus identifies himself as the Son. The angel Gabriel in Luke identifies Jesus as the Son, said, "Who will be called the Son of the Most High." John the Baptist says he has seen and he says, "I've seen and bear witness that this is the Son of God," talking about Jesus. His followers repeatedly identify him as the Son of God. Matter of fact, they bow down and worship him and call him the Son of God. You've got Martha calls him the Son of God. You have the Roman centurion and the other Roman soldiers who identify him as the Son of God. You have demons who scream, "You are the Son of God," as he's casting them out. And even the Jewish leaders who rejected Jesus at his crucifixion, they're condemning him for calling himself the Son of God. So the point is, everyone, you're talking Father, Son, Holy Spirit, angel, prophet, apostles, demons, everyone who could possibly identify him as the Son of God identifies him as the Son of God, or at least admits that he was claiming to be the Son of God. That's what we find when we go to the 1st century documents. And so when someone comes along centuries later and says, "I have a revelation from God, Jesus was never the Son of God, never claimed to be, no one identified him as such, this makes no sense," and we look at the 1st century evidence, it's like, wait a minute. How can this guy be a Muslim when him and everyone around him acknowledge that he's calling himself the Son of God, which would be the unforgivable sin of shirk in Islam, in which case you can't say with a straight face that Jesus was a Muslim prophet when, according to Islam, what happened in the 1st century would be one massive example of Jesus repeatedly committing the worst possible sin in Islam. You can't say so-and-so's a prophet, but so-and-so also spent his entire life committing the worst possible sin, and he's a true prophet. Muslims believe in Allah's protection of the prophets. Allah protects prophets from falling into major error. So if Allah protects prophets from falling into major error, and Jesus claims to be the Son of God and gives that impression to everyone around him, and the only counterexample you have is something that comes along centuries later, when a guy in Arabia says, no, I got a revelation from God, it contradicts every shred of evidence that we actually have. I hope you understand why we would not take Muhammad's claim seriously when it contradicts all the 1st century data that we have, and why we couldn't possibly consider Jesus a Muslim prophet when he did what would be in Islam the worst possible sin, and therefore, according to Islam, would be a mushrik. He would not be a prophet.